Welcome to my YouTube channel, Mark at A Matter of Truth. All of my Bible teaching songs are based upon my sound biblical Bible studies on my website at thechurchofthefirstborn.net.
All right, let's dive right into this explainer and unpack a very specific, totally non-mainstream theological worldview straight from the Church of the Firstborn website. We're going to take a really close look at a text that challenges centuries of traditional theology. The author goes verse by verse to build a completely different understanding of biblical cosmology. So whether you're already deeply familiar with these theological debates or entirely new to them, we're going to objectively break down the source material and see exactly how this unique framework is put together. You know, it's absolutely fascinating how different groups of people can read the exact same ancient text and just walk away with entirely different realities. And that is exactly what we see happening with one single sentence from the New Testament, Colossians 1:19. The author of our source material points out that depending on the theological lens you're wearing, these few ancient Greek words can be interpreted to support radically different versions of who Jesus was when he existed and what his ultimate purpose actually is. To keep us on track and impartially understand the author's interpretation, here is our roadmap for today. 1. The biblical Unitarian viewpoint. 2. Challenging mainstream traditions. 3. The timeline of deity. 4. Decoding Colossians chapter 1. And finally, 5. The cosmic war context. Okay, part 1. The biblical Unitarian viewpoint. We really need to understand this foundational paradigm before we go any further.
According to the source, biblical Unitarianism entirely rejects the idea that Jesus had a pre-human existence in eternity past. The author is adamant that Almighty God the Father is a completely separate, singular entity. Jesus, in this view, began his existence entirely as a human being. There was absolutely no eternal past for the Son. He was created, he lived out his life as a man, and any divine status he eventually achieved was granted to him much, much later.
Moving right along to part 2, challenging mainstream Christian traditions. Let's contrast this with established doctrines.
To truly grasp this text, you've got to know what it's actively pushing back against. The author is pretty aggressive in critiquing two major theological camps. First, oneness Pentecostals, who believe God the Father literally manifested himself bodily as Jesus. And second, Trinitarians, who believe in a pre-existent God the Son holding two natures simultaneously. Our source argues that mainstream Christians basically take verses out of context to fit these denominational traditions, instead of just letting the words speak for themselves.
Which brings us to part 3, the timeline of deity. Let's map out this chronological progression of Christ.
So instead of possessing two simultaneous natures at once, the text argues for a strict chronological timeline. It's step by step. According to the author, Jesus was born strictly as a human. He lived, and he showed total obedience to God by suffering on the cross. And the key here is that it was only after this obedience, after his resurrection, that God highly exalted him and literally made him both Lord and Christ. He was elevated to a deity status to rule over the earth for a 1,000-year reign, essentially earning it through human obedience.
All right, part 4, decoding Colossians chapter 1. Let's dive into our verse-by-verse case study.
Here's the pivotal verse we're looking at today, straight from the King James Version. For it pleased the Father that in him should all fullness dwell. The author claims that mainstream traditions totally isolate this single verse. They point to the word fullness to instantly claim, see, Jesus was always God. But our source insists that if you actually read the surrounding verses, if you look at the whole picture, a completely different story emerges.
And that forces us to ask a really critical question, especially using the source's own heavy emphasis here. What actually pleased the Father enough to trigger this massive transformation? I mean, think about it. If Jesus was already God, he wouldn't need to be given fullness, right? So what exactly did he do to earn it?
The text gives a pretty fascinating answer. It posits that it was the strict, uncompromising obedience of his human Son. When tempted by Satan, Jesus chose to completely submit his own human will and obey his Father instead. He literally chose to suffer and die. The author argues that it was exactly this supreme act of human submission that pleased the Father. It wasn't some pre-existing divine nature that pleased God. No, it was a human being making the ultimate choice of obedience over rebellion.
Because of that incredible obedience, God granted him all fullness. But what does that actually mean in this context? Well, the author breaks it down into very specific acquired traits. Jesus was given the fullness of deity to become Lord of the Sabbath, to become a king, and to become a God to rule the earth during the coming age. Plus, he was granted the divine nature of immortality. And what's absolutely wild here is the author's note that everyday believers will also be made partakers of this exact same divine nature of immortality to rule alongside him.
To back up the claim that Jesus had no divine power of his own during his earthly life, the author points to verses like John 5:19, where Jesus flat out states, "The Son can do nothing of himself." The source material argues this is absolute proof that during his ministry, Jesus was entirely human, strictly subject to his God, and acting only through the power God specifically permitted him to use step by step.
And finally, Part 5, the cosmic war context. Let's look at the ultimate motive behind this whole exaltation.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. The author's ultimate claim dives deep into an ancient cosmic conflict. According to the text, Yahweh created the human Son of Man for a highly specific tactical purpose, to have dominion over the works of God's hands and to physically still his enemies, specifically Satan and the fallen angels. The source actually references a previous age of the earth, a time way before man, when Lucifer and a third of the angels waged war against the throne of Almighty God. So Jesus was given deity status, exalted to be a king and a god, specifically to act as God's ordained judge over these ancient rebellious entities.
It really leaves us with a fascinating paradigm to chew on. According to the detailed arguments presented in this text, everything we just explored, the timeline of Jesus, his human obedience, his exaltation to deity, all of it might simply be one tactical move in an ancient ongoing war in heaven. It completely reframes the entire biblical narrative from a purely human-centric story into this vast, interdimensional conflict. It makes you wonder how much of history is just the surface of a much deeper, unseen battle. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the text.
Please read the in-depth Bible studies on my websites at AMatterOfTruth and thechurchofthefirstborn.net. And if you like this Bible teaching song video, please share the link with others. Thanks for watching, and may God bless you richly for sharing the true gospel. Brother Mark.